So enough of that. Now, Alex Lawrence needs little introduction. She's one of the superstars of the program at the British Institute of Flowers, originally from Alabama, educated substantially on the West Coast at San Francisco State University, and then on further studies at University of Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and 25 years in March in Florence. Yeah, and so più Fiorentina che Alabamina. True stuff. And she's going to talk to us tonight about Petrarch, which I'm personally looking forward to very much, because I know quite a lot about Dante and Boccaccio, but very little about Petrarch. So tonight I'll know more. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, I've turned on. This is my first time using this. So are we good? Everyone can hear me there? Hopefully. Oh, yeah. Oh, clap. Thank you. I love that. Now, being from Alabama, this is kind of a rough way to get introduced. But I actually went and did my undergraduate in Charleston, South Carolina, where I was, in fact, in a sorority. And we used to snap rather than clap when we wanted to give, yes, indeed. So we would give little snaps to one another whenever someone would do something good. This is, getting out of hand at this point. But thank you so much. Thank you, Jane Lewis. I hope you are here. Thank you so much for sponsoring. Thank you all for being here. I didn't know what to expect with Petrarch, if he would draw a crowd, wouldn't draw a crowd. Do we love him? Are we indifferent to him? Do we loathe him and hope I'm going to change your mind? I'm not sure. We shall see as we continue tonight. In typical Petrarch form, I'm going to start and make this all about me. Petrarch, I think, would be proud. So when Simon and I were speaking about me doing lectures this coming spring, we said, okay, I'm doing a course, an upcoming course on, we've titled it Mystics, Magicians, and Madmen of the Renaissance, where we're really looking at some of these mystical traditions and the role of magic, witchcraft, these sorts of things. But essentially, it's about seekers. It's about these people, in particular, in the 15th century, a lot of them, of course, in and around Florence, that were looking to go deeper. These were people who were looking for truth in all different places, and really fascinating places and spaces. And so in an effort to, I think maybe Simon just wants to learn more about Petrarch himself, but also to kind of tie it into a little bit of again, self-promotion here. We started thinking about Petrarch perhaps as a kind of springboard, himself as, I hesitate ever to use these kind of proto-terms, proto-Renaissance man, when we talk about women, proto-feminists. I sort of stay very far away from those sorts of things, but certainly someone who he himself, he was a seeker, as we're going to see tonight. So this is, let's say, the reason behind me talking to you about Petrarch. I am not an expert on Petrarch. I, of course, have looked at him in my graduate work, and I have to say, not a huge fan of his poetry. Simon, I didn't tell you that before you booked me tonight, but it's all going down. It's all going down. I mean, well, let's say in comparison, right, to maybe some other poets. But I am fascinated by him. I'm fascinated by Petrarch. I'm fascinated by the man that he was, by the various Petrarchs. And I think that he lived, of course, from 1304 to 1374. So we're talking, 700 years ago at this point. And someone who has had various kind of iterations of his legacy and these sorts of things. And I just find him fascinating. So while I might not sort of read Petrarch every night before I go to bed, I certainly was thrilled, to have the opportunity to come and speak about him tonight. Although I would sort of love to know, and on Zoom, I can't see all your lovely faces, but even just here in the room, who is, sort of a massive fan of Petrarch, loves his poetry, has one person? For real? Did I miss? I not what? Who is not a fan of Petrarch? Like an avid not fan? Who doesn't know anything about Petrarch? Or beautiful. I love this. Okay, so This is amazing. Well, front row, the only one. On Zoom, I would love to know. You're still, I know, because you don't even have me. But quite frankly, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about his poetry. We will get to it, of course. But even if I say Petrarch, is there anything that comes to mind about Petrarch? Okay, one of the three crowns, right? The tre corone, so the Italian language. I love that. Yes. Any humanism? Okay, fabulous. Let's see, Gail. Good job. Yes. Ellie? Yeah. Exactly. He had a famous love. In fact, this is the thing that I thought was going to come up first. So thank you, Ellie. He had a famous love. Laura, his famous love. Okay. And so oftentimes when we talk about Petrarch, the first thing that comes to mind is all of that poetry that he ostensibly wrote about Laura. We will get to why it's actually not all about Laura, but all about Petrarch. In fact, so I'm going to start off with two text-heavy slides. Do not worry, I'm not just going to come up here and read to you from his letters, although I kind of want to, because as I said, I'm not a huge fan of Petrarch's poetry, but I adore his letters. I think they are absolutely fascinating. I'm not alone in this, of course. But this is really where I want to start. I want to start by giving you an introduction, not sort of starting at the beginning and going through, though we will, of course, root him in those 70 years that he lived. But I want to start by reading to you from a letter that he wrote to his friend and confessor, okay, someone called Dionigi da San Sepolcro. This was a man who was very close to him. He was from Petrarch, I don't want to say sort of native Tuscany, but someone that he had a very deep relationship with. And when Petrarch was in his 30s, early 30s, he and his brother were on vacation. We're going to see how Petrarch was our first sort of modern tourist. He and his brother were on vacation. They were traveling for pleasure, and they decided to go on a hike. They were in Provence, and there was a mountain that Petrarch tells us that at least they had run into a shepherd on the way up the mountain who said, I went up to the top of the mountain many years ago. It wasn't worth it. It's too hard to get to. And I know for a fact that no one had done it before me. And until you think you're going to do it, no one's going to do it. So Petrarch, this is all not true, by the way. We found out later that a lot of people had climbed this mountain. At any rate, he ascends. He takes this journey with his brother. Okay, his brother is slightly younger. His brother was a friar, so he was a religious man, and the brother took the ardent, hard path. At a certain point, they sort of diverged, and Petrarch decided, I'm going to take the easy path. And what he found, he does this not once, but twice while he's climbing the mountain, that the path that was the easy path actually took him down, so that he had to work doubly hard to get up. So he said, my brother was smart. He took the path. I should also point out Petrarch, in this letter that he writes to his confessor, when he's talking about who he was trying to find someone to go with, he says, and he writes this beautiful letter, but he says, it had to be someone who wasn't going to be annoying, either because they were complaining too much or because they were too enthusiastic. I don't want, the cheerleader, and I don't want the complainer. He says, I don't want someone who's too fast, because then I'm going to lag behind. I also don't want someone who's too slow, because then that's annoying, right? He says, I want someone who is, I don't want someone who's going to talk too much, but I don't want someone who's going to be quiet and make me do all the work. So it's like, who am I going to find? So finally says, I decided to go with my brother. So already you can tell, right? He's setting out, this day trip is getting very impegnativo, as we say. And so he recounts, again, as he goes up, that it was a very arduous climb. He says he wasn't in shape for it, and he gets to the very top. And he's right. So remember, he and his brother are far from home, but they have to stay in an inn, right? So he's writing to this friend confessor after the fact. So I'm just going to read you here what he is, part of this. I have 2 slides, and then I promise you, no heavy text. But he says, at first, owing to the unaccustomed quality of the air and the effect of the great sweep of view spread out before me, I stood like one dazed. I beheld the clouds under our feet, and what I had read of Athos and Olympus seemed less incredible, as I myself witnessed the same things from a mountain of less fame. I turned my eyes towards Italy, whither my heart most inclined. The Alps, rugged and snow-capped, seemed to rise close by, although they were really at a great distance. The very same Alps through which that fierce enemy of the Roman name once made his way, bursting the rocks, if we may believe the report, by the application of vinegar. I sighed, I must confess, for the skies of Italy, which I beheld rather with my mind than with my eyes. An inexpressible longing came over me to see once more my friend and my country. Okay, so as he gets to the top, he says he looks out, and he's having this kind of meditation, right, on nature. But then it quickly turns into something much more, because he is looking out to Italy. He's looking out to what he calls his homeland. He is born in Arezzo in 1304. And he tells us very clearly, we're going to see in a moment, that he was born in exile. His father had been exiled from Florence. And so he's born to these Florentine parents. And so here he is saying to this confessor friend who is from Tuscany, I'm longing to see you, but also Italy. So as he's, kind of taking this walk, he's using it as an opportunity to start to reflect on a variety of things. Not only Italy, what we also heard in there was a bit of a meditation on the ancient. So all of that is kind of coming to bear in this letter. It's called the ascent of Mount Ventoux, which is, as I said, in Provence. It is a mountain. I knew nothing about this, and I confess I still know very little about this, but the Tour de France apparently sometimes will take this route, but not this year. It starts in Florence this year for the very first time, and it's not going to. I thought that would be such a lovely connection. Alas, it's not to be. At any rate, then he goes on in this letter. What does Petrarch say after his meditation on Italy and on the ancients and kind of having this conversation with himself? He says to his confessor here. So he says, it occurred to me to look into my copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, a gift that I owe to your love, talking to Dionigi Sant'Epolco, and that I always have about me in memory of both the author and the giver. I opened the compact little volume, small indeed in size, but of infinite charm, with the intention of reading whatever came to hand, for I could happen upon nothing that would be otherwise than edifying and devout. Now it chanced that the 10th book presented itself. My brother, waiting to hear something of St. Augustine from my lips, stood attentively by. I call him, and God too, to witness that where I first fixed my eyes, it was written. So he's telling us that it just happened to fall open to this very thing. Are you ready? Quoting here from where the book fell open. And men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains and the mighty waves of the sea and the wide sweep of rivers and the circuit of the ocean and the revolution of the stars, but themselves they consider not. I was abashed, and asking my brother, who was anxious to hear more, not to annoy me, I closed the book, angry with myself that I should still be admiring earthly things who might long ago have learned from even the pagan philosophers that nothing is wonderful but the soul, which, when great itself, finds nothing outside itself. Here we go. Then, in truth, I was satisfied that I had seen enough of the mountain. I turned my inward eye upon myself, and from that time, not a syllable fell from my lips until we reached the bottom again. So here is Petrarch telling us that it just happened to fall open to the most perfect, the most, the line that most corresponded to exactly what he was thinking. But look at what he's telling us, right? When I said Petrarch would be proud that I started this all about me, this is what Petrarch does, right? As he's talking to, and he's writing, I shouldn't say talking to, as he's writing, and you can see this is a very conversational letter. It's entertaining, actually. We sort of feel like we're right there with Petrarch, up on the top of this mountain. But he tells us that instead of, he sort of feels abashed by reading Augustine, and he says, now I'm going to turn away from these worldly things and I'm going to turn my eye inward. So it is very much this self-reflection that takes over Petrarch. Now, we see this a lot in Petrarch, where he, the letters that he crafts, and he has, most of them written in Latin. But the epistolary collection of Petrarch is one of the great epistolary collections of the Italian peninsula, surely. And often he would use these letters, right? These are not letters the way that we might write a letter, okay, to a friend or a note or a quick email, something like this, but rather pieces of work that he studied, that he would have revised, that he understood would have been made public, either after his death or because they would be disseminated, they would be copied and shown and shared with other people. So he used his letters to be able to communicate his thoughts in a way that others maybe used speeches, orations, or treaties, these sorts of things. But certainly what we also see in this letter, which is so wonderful, it's so entertaining, it really roots us there, almost like we're standing next to Petrarch. What Petrarch is doing is he's giving us his narrative. He's self-fashioning. He's giving us his story. He's making he's delivering, right, the version of himself that he wants us to see. And I think that anyone who says that Petrarch would not be the king of social media today has no idea what they're talking about, because this is exactly what they do, right? What they do. Well, maybe we all do. We put out that version of ourselves that we want people to see. We want to communicate something. We know that it's going to be looked at by people other than our close set of friends. That's exactly what Petrarch was doing. So we talk a lot about Petrarch and how he's the first modern man. We talk about him in terms of humanism and these sorts of things. It is always amazing to me, and I get this a lot, I feel this a lot with Dante as well, that these people who are writing so many centuries ago feel like they would be completely at home in our time and place. And I very much get this sense with Petrarch. So as I mentioned, Petrarch he also tells us that he was, where he was born. This is in a letter that he calls Letter to Posterity. It's one of his last, it's the last in a collection of letters called the Seniles, which were the letters in old age. But he says, my parents were honorable, Florentine in origin, and possessed of a middling wealth, or if I should speak truly, verging on poverty. They were expelled from our homeland, and so I was born in exile in Arezzo in the year of this last age, which began with Christ, 1304, at dawn on a Monday, the 20th of July. Okay, so he gives us a lot of information in one sentence, or a couple of sentences. He tells us that his parents were Florentine. Important, very important. Right? Where he comes from. He says, but I was born in exile from our homeland. So he counts himself, and the Florentines are very happy to have him count himself one of their number. Right? So he says, I was born in exile, even though it was his father. By the way, Francesco Petrarca's father was in the same exile as Dante at the beginning of the 1300s. So the very same group of white Guelphs that had been exiled, and for a while, in fact, Dante hung around with them. Then he got sick of them complaining all the time and wanting to get back in. So he sort of leaves them. But Petrarch's father was part of this. So Petrarch himself, born in 1304 in Arezzo. But his father, this is so interesting, verging on poverty, right? So his father was a notary. We all know notaries in Italy. In the Renaissance, still today, these are not, sort of stamp on the piece of paper. These are quite high-ranking figures in civic life. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, if we're looking at these years, again, 1304 to 1374, what's happening during those years? Massive amounts of social upheaval. Number one, the papacy leaving Rome and going to Avignon. This is, maybe those of you who aren't Catholic or aren't so interested in the Pope go, it doesn't really matter. They built a grand papal residence over in Avignon. What's the big deal? It's still, he can rule from anywhere, right? This was a massive, massive shift, and it produced a tremendous amount of anxiety. So for the majority of the 1300s, the papal seat was in Avignon. Okay, this also has directly something to do with Petrarch. Because Petrarch's father is a notary, they're in Arezzo. He's exiled. We all know what exile does to a person. It takes away all of your contacts, right? All of your sort of ability to be able to be as successful as you would be in your hometown. And so what does Petrarch's father decide to do? Move the family to the south of France, to near Avignon, where he hoped and did get hired essentially to be part of this massive papal bureaucracy. So Petrarch says, I'm in exile in Arezzo, and then he kind of goes into this second exile as a young child, right, where he goes to France. He always had Tuscan tutors, so it was very important for his family in particular to make sure his tutor was called Convenevole da Prato, so he had Tuscan tutors there in near Avignon. They didn't live right in Avignon, but close by. And so here I have a couple of images. There is in Arezzo, some of you may be familiar with it, but there is a home, the Casa di Petrarca. It's been completely refurbished, redone. I'm not sure how much of Petrarca is actually there, but there's at least a sense of his neighborhood and where he was born and lived the first few years of his life. And then I include this image here of Avignon just to reiterate that this was not, some little backwater thing where the popes moved. They, as I said, had all of the infrastructure. They had all of the beautiful trappings, but in particular, the court, right? The papal court. So here is Petrarch, who grows up in a courtly environment in those years. Now, I mentioned 1304 to 1374. So we've talked about the papacy going. It's another huge event that happened right in the middle of Petrarch's life. 1348, the plague. The plague. So right away, if we're just again kind of rooting ourselves with Petrarch in these 70 years, we're talking about a century that was marked by two incredibly powerful events, right? Petrarch was never really interested in following in his father's footsteps. And as we know, in Italy, and especially during this time, most fathers didn't take very well to you not wanting to follow in their footsteps. And so Petrarch, even though he adores literature and really recounts how he fought his father tooth and nail. I don't want to go to university to study law. I don't want to do it. It's not my passion. It's not. His father got so sick of him complaining all the time about being sent away, first to Montpellier and then to Bologna, that his father did something truly, truly unforgivable. He started a bonfire. He started a big fire, and he started throwing Petrarch's books, his beloved manuscripts and his books, onto the fire in punishment for Petrarch complaining, about having to do this. And at the very last moment, his father goes in and pulls Virgil out of the fire and pulls Cicero out of the fire and says, you can keep these. These are the ones you can keep. Everything else is going to go. Okay, so Petrarch, of course, he's a young man. He has no agency, right? He's not emancipated. What do? At about age 16, he goes, so he's born in Arezzo in exile. Then he goes to the south of France. He's raised in this courtly environment there. And around the age of 16, he is sent to Bologna to study law because his father wants him to, right? So he goes to Bologna, and this is where this idea of Petrarch as a traveler. So it's not only exile, which he'll talk about quite a bit actually in his letters and in his sort of life philosophy of being in exile, but he goes to Bologna. And let's be honest, a 16-year-old in Bologna who has a couple of bucks, he says his parents were borderline poverty, but if he's being sent to Bologna, he's not incredibly wealthy, but certainly enough to be able to have a life there as a student. Imagine that many of you are familiar with Bologna. Bologna is a fun city, right? Even still today, big university, lots of great live music, great music culture, university culture still today, right? Petrarch, 16-year-old Francesco Petrarca, goes to Bologna, and what is he getting up to? Not a whole lot of studying. Right? He's a mildly good-looking man, as I said. He's got a bit of money, and now he's got all this time and all of these new people that he's meeting, and he's going to class. It's not like he's completely disinterested. He is interested in especially the ancient jurists, and so but his passion is literature, so he doesn't feel this kind of fire. But he writes letters, and these are very youthful letters back home to his family, for example, talking about how beautiful all the women are, for example, right? That takes up a lot more space than things about his studies. Let's say that. But while he's in Bologna, so he's not excelling while he's at university. This is not going to be the next great jurist or notary or lawyer or something like this. While he's in Bologna, a couple of things happen. Number one, his mother dies. And the very first poem that we have from Petrarch is upon his mother's death. So this is the very first time as a young man in Bologna that we have any kind of poetic output from him. But his father, who was satisfied because now he's in Bologna, he's doing his thing. And so he says, let's collaborate. Let's put a manuscript together. And so they put together what is now called the Ambrosian Virgil. This is because it's held at the Ambrosiana in Milan. And what it is, and we're not really sure how much his father had to do with the formation of this manuscript. But what it is a collection of these works and more. So we have the Bucolics, the Georgics, and the Aeneid by Virgil. We have the Achilleid by Statius, and 4 odes by Horace, along with analyses, right, by the ancients, but also by Petrarch himself. Over 2,500 comments by Petrarch himself. He is, it's a kind of portable library, okay? Petrarch brings this with him wherever he goes. It is an absolutely precious document. He himself commissions wonderful Sienese artist Simone Martini to do the cover for this. So this is something that is very close to his heart, very close to his head, his soul, everything. And so we get this sense, right, that there is this kind of meeting of the minds between Petrarch and his father, even though we know in 1326, as soon as his father dies, so now his mother is gone, his father is gone, he's in Bologna studying a subject that he doesn't want to study. You think he finishes his degree in Bologna? No. Now he's really able to live it up because now he has no family expectations and he's got money. He's got the money from his inheritance. And so he goes back to Avignon and he switched. He goes back to Avignon at some point. Oop. Am I frozen here? There we go. He goes back to Avignon. Now it's going to go through all of my bed. No. And he and his brother, okay, his brother had not yet taken vows. And so he and his brother are 2 single men about town and have an absolute ball and run through that inheritance very, very quickly. So here he finds himself, no degree, no money, no money. great, no mother, you know, come on, you've got to figure out who's going to cook, who's going to do this, no prospects. I mean, he doesn't have, the marriage has not been arranged. Here we are in a place that he doesn't consider his homeland. Okay. And he needs to and I was going to say also with this great passion for literature and for philosophy and for manuscripts and for books. And so what is a man to do? So he takes, this will surprise no one, he takes low-level religious vows. Okay, that means he's not a priest who is performing the sacraments, right? And a parish priest. He is someone who can be hired by families, well-to-do families like the Colonna, for example, that he has a great relationship with. He can be hired by them and sort of be on staff. And so it's a way for him to be able to make money. It's a way for him to have access to libraries. Okay. And it's a way for him to travel. And that's what he starts to do. He starts to travel. I think I mentioned sometimes he's referred to as the first tourist. Why? Because he's the first person, at least, that tells us about traveling for pleasure, not just for business, not for a religious pilgrimage, for example. And because he has this mad, insatiable lust for books and for a couple of other things, it's kind of, said sex diary. So might give it away there. But because he has this insatiable lust for books and manuscripts in particular and antiquity, he starts to travel. And on these travels with his friends, what does he start to do? He starts to kind of plan his travel to correspond with libraries that he wants to go through. So he's a manuscript hunter. Can you imagine? Where is the movie of Petrarch? I ask you, where is it? He's going to Germany, for example, this wonderful letter that he writes to us from Cologne, where he gives us a beautiful description of the city. And he's a true tourist in the sense that he is someone who is a foreigner in all ways. So he's kind of writing in this letter, oh, they're weird customs, and this is what they do, and these people, and this is how they dress. And it's fascinating, right? Because he's able to just kind of look at it from the outside and then bring these thoughts to us. But at one point, he writes two beautiful letters from Cologne, but elsewhere in Germany, they had gone to a particular town, and he said, I was on the hunt and I found this manuscript, this Ciceronian manuscript, and I had to have it. I had to have it copied, but I couldn't find anyone to copy it. It's not like being, back in Italy where copyists are a dime a dozen. He said, so he ended up delaying. He and his friends had to stay for a bunch of extra days because he said it was so hard to find a copyist. But here's this man in his late 20s, early 30s, who is traveling in the 1300s, traveling around Europe, hunting down these manuscripts, and then writing these letters and sharing with us all of these thoughts. And again, because he had taken these low-level vows, he's able to sort of finance it in that way. Yes, he did keep it. I think sex diary is a little much. It was just a list of people that he had had relations with in a certain time period in the 1340s. This is also why I love Petrarch. Because he was someone, as you saw, he carries Augustine's Confessions around with him. This is not a person who goes easy on himself. This is someone who very much gets into a lot of fun situations and then immediately goes, I shouldn't do that. Oh, Augustine famously make me chaste, just not yet. And so he had a very strong affinity with the early Christian church father Augustine. And so what we know from this quote unquote sex diary is that he was keeping track, but that he was also kind of beating himself up about it, because he says, he says, one more year. I'm giving myself one more year and then I'm done with the whole thing. I'm not going to touch another woman. That's going to be it. I'm an old man. I'm 40. I'm finished. That's it for me. Then the next year, one more year, one more. And then I promise that's it. That's absolutely it. But there he is assiduously, sort of writing this down. So I hope what I'm doing is giving you a sort of picture here of someone who, and listen, we haven't talked about Laura one time, or his poetry, we shall get there, but giving you a picture of someone who had a very rich interior life, but also a very rich life with his companions as well, and with his friends, and travel, and writing, and wanting to share. Now, Petrarch, who had, from the time that he was a child, right, we see the pulling out of the Virgil from the flames, he has an obsession. It is an absolute obsession with antiquity, okay, with ancient Rome in particular. And he makes his very first trip to Rome. Can you imagine? In 1337. He's 33 years old, and he goes to Rome for the very first time. Now, this is someone who is writing us from all over his travels. You see, when he climbs a mountain, he tells us every single thing. He goes to Rome in 1337, and he says, there are no words. I can't talk about it. I cannot find the words to describe what I felt when I got to Rome. Some of you may have had this sensation as well, maybe with Florence, maybe with other places where it's somewhere that has such an important place in your heart and your soul. And he got there, and he just simply couldn't. He found that it was ineffable. He could not find the words to describe his love for Rome. But what he did, or his love for actually being there, what he did, he goes back to Avignon, or thereabouts, and he really doubles down on his work, on his Latin work, the L'Africa, which he thought would be the thing that we would be standing here talking about. Okay, this is a kind of through line. Boccaccio has this as well. I don't think Petrarch would ever think that we would be standing here talking about his Canzoniere, for example, which is what everybody learns about in school, for example. I don't think Boccaccio ever thought we'd be standing here talking about the Decameron, right? They wrote these incredibly highbrow. L'Africa is incomplete, because the reason I'm not putting years on a lot of these titles is because Petrarch was constantly going back and revising. So we sort of know when he starts, but L'Africa is incomplete. But so many of his works are this way, where he's constantly going back and touching and retouching and editing and re-editing. So he spends the last years of the 1330s really working in solitude. I mean, Petrarch is amazing because during the pandemic, I discovered I'm an ambivert. I really like people, and I like being out, and then I really like going home and just kind of decompressing a bit, and then maybe getting a couple days later, getting another little fix. This was Petrarch. Petrarch loved people. He loved to share. He loved to communicate. Most times he found people annoying. A lot of the times he was a bit of a misanthrope, and he would spend large chunks of time where he would essentially retire from all company. Okay, so he had a hard time with that sort of balance between the active and the contemplative life, and so he spends these years really deep into these studies and this writing, I should say, in antiquity, and in particular in his Latin, right? Really refining his Latin, right? And trying to get it as close to the version of the ancients and the ancient Romans, Livy in particular, as he possibly could. And at the beginning of the 1340s, he gets called down to Naples. He goes to Naples because the king of Naples, who is called Robert I, Robert the Wise, d'Anjou, he calls Petrarch to Naples. Petrarch had been, again, Petrarch is someone who's not shy, does self-promotion better than most. And so, he's kind of getting the word out. Hey, I would love to be poet laureate. I would love to have the laurel crown. And Robert calls Petrarch down, and he says, let's come for several days. He stays for several weeks, and he undergoes several days of examination by Robert on everything, all sorts of subjects, all, of course, being based in the classics. Robert was so impressed. He says, absolutely, this man is deserving of the laurel crown. He says to Petrarch, where would you like to be crowned? Where do we want to have this ceremony? In Paris, right, the great center of scholastic thought, or in Rome. Now remember, this is 1341. So Rome isn't Rome the way that we think of it in either earlier or later. Rome, not a lot was happening in Rome during this time period, but this is the moment when Petrarch says, Rome. He says, I want to be crowned in Rome. I want to be crowned on the Capitoline Hill to receive the laurel crown there in the center of and in the seat of the ancients. And with that, Petrarch, who was getting to be quite well known, pretty famous, he was someone that people looked up to and admired and followed and kept up with. For Petrarch to say, I want to be crowned there, that was like saying emphasis on Rome. So not on Paris and the university kind of culture and the scholastic culture, but rather Rome and classical antiquity. So this is a huge move on his part. It's a great communication on his part of a great message, let's say, of his devotion and dedication to antiquity. When he goes back to Rome, he goes in 1341, again, to receive the laurel crown. He stays for several weeks, as you do. And he ran around with one of his very good friends, who was also a friar, who was called, who was a monk, he was called Colonna, Giovanni Colonna, from the noble, Roman noble family of the Colonna. And he writes a letter. I know you're shocked. He writes a letter to Giovanni later that year, after he had left Rome, after they had spent all this time together. And the letter is basically, it's like a blog post. It's something where it says, remember when we went here and we did this, and when we talked about that, and he goes through all of their conversations. And there's this beautiful passage where he says, remember the night that we walked up and we were standing on the roof of the ruins of the baths of Diocletian? And we were standing there and we had all of antiquity, all of ancient Rome beneath us. And we were talking, and you were talking more about modern history, and I was talking more about ancient history. And he says, who can doubt that Rome would rise up again if she but began to know herself? Because what happened in Petrarch's second trip to Rome is that he got annoyed. He got annoyed because he looked around and he said, all of that glory, all of that genius, political, linguistic, artistic, literary, all of that, it's gone. It's in dust and fragments. They don't even know their history. These Romans, he said, have no idea what Rome was. But what I think is so interesting, and I'm not certainly alone in this, is that Petrarch here is not saying, ugh, just forget it. I mean, now look at us. We have fallen so far. Right? We're in such a bad state. We're never coming back from this. There is that glimmer, that tiny little glimmer of hope. If they knew about it, Rome could rise again. If they knew. So let's teach them. Let's tell them. Let's show them what Rome was. And that's going to be the thing that is going to bring the glory of Rome back. So rather than reading this as just kind of misanthropic Petrarch who's complaining about how the Romans don't know how to value what they have, he gives, right, that little bit of hope there, that perhaps, if they just had the knowledge. And I think this is something really important to keep in mind, is that Petrarch's passion, it's a little bit like university, and I don't know if there are any professors or former professors out there, but people who get into the academy, right, and they're constantly, kind of closed into this bubble, and they've got lots of admin stuff, and they've got lots of, they're drilling down on their research, and it feels very like they don't have big picture, right? And it also feels a lot like work, just regular work, kind of time card work, where you're going in and you're doing your research and you're doing your writing and you're doing your teaching, but that passion, that flame, that flicker has gone out, right? But instead, there are those who, if you can keep that passion alive and you really believe in it, right? And I think we've probably all had professors that were this way, right? Maybe they've been in the classroom for 40 years and they can still inspire. And this is because they believe in it. They're not just writing because that's what they've by now, the road they've gone down, and that's what they have to do. And that's really, Petrarch had an absolute utter passion. And he thought that if he could communicate that passion, then Rome, let's say, could rise again. Now, here we are finally at his poetry. Funnily enough, he leaves Rome and then he goes and he starts writing in the vernacular. Yeah, interesting. You know, he's an artist. He's always changing it up. He starts to write his Canzoniere after he receives his laurel crown. Who knows? Maybe once he got was named poet laureate, he felt comfortable, right, enough to use the vernacular, which was just becoming an illustrious vernacular. Dante, dies in 1321. So we're not talking about a whole lot of time for this vernacular to have become what it will be. And Petrarch, of course, is going to play a major role in this. So he starts to write his canzoniere. So canzoniere or rime sparse, scattered rhymes, as they're called. And he starts to write them just after receiving the crown, the laurel crown in 1341, and he works on them all the way up until 1374 when he died. So the final version that we have, the order that these 366 poems are in, we have no reason to believe that was the definitive version. That was just where he left off when he died. Okay? But we know that he was working on these all the way up until his death, reordering them, editing them, so on and so forth. 317 of them are sonnets. So no one said when he said, what do you know about Petrarch? Laura, okay, but the Petrarchan sonnet. So he does not invent the sonnet, but he might as well have, because he made it so terribly popular, right, in his Canzoniere. And we'll talk about in just a moment why the Canzoniere was the thing that really took off. But he starts writing the poems, and then mostly by the mid 1350s, they had already all been drafted. And it's a fictional chronology. So it's before the death of Madonna Laura and after the death of Madonna Laura. Now, we've talked about Laura. We've said her name a couple of times. Who was she? We don't know. Okay. Was she? Question mark. We don't know. The point is this. We know a few things. We have the flyleaf of his Virgil, that where he notes the deaths of his friends and family. Remember, his portable library, okay, that he takes with him. In the Secretum, which is another work by Petrarch, he talks about a woman, Laura, being a woman worn out with frequent childbearing, how she will have a short life. So this is a kind of biographical little piece of information. We have one of his poems, a canzone called Voglia mi sprona, and there he speaks about Laura, and I've included here the lines where he says, 1327, exactly at the first hour of the 6th day of April, I entered the labyrinth, nor do I see where I may get out of it. So he tells us that he sees this woman called Laura in church on Good Friday, of course, gives us the exact year, and then proceeds to write, essentially, not all the poems have Laura in them. There are probably about 340 of them that have Laura in them. So an obscene amount of poetry that has to do with this woman. Okay. Now, when I first started studying Petrarch, I would get really bored. This is maybe one of the reasons why I don't love his poetry, but I would get really bored because it's unrequited. Of course, Laura had no idea that Francesco Petrarca existed. Okay. And so there are 366 poems about unrequited love. How much can you say, right? And we had a lot to say, but it's like you read one, you read two, you read the third one, and you're kind of like, okay, get out a little more, meet some other people, try something different. Let's see what we can do. But so yeah, exactly. You're good looking by now. You've got the laurel crown. That's got to do something for you. And so it's kind of like, what is this? They're not at all about Laura. I mean, this is the beauty of really reading Petrarch's poetry, is what you actually find is that they're all about him. They're all about him. So whether or not this woman existed, it does not matter. I just want to read this to you here. This is Pace non trova. It's an absolutely beautiful sonnet. So I'll read it in English. I find no peace and have no arms for war, and fear and hope and burn, and yet I freeze and fly to heaven lying on earth's floor, and nothing hold, and all the world I seize. My jailer opens not, nor locks the door, nor binds me to hear, nor will loose my ties. Love kills me not, nor breaks the chains I wear, nor wants me living, nor will grant me ease. I have no tongue and shout, eyeless I see. I long to perish and I beg for aid. I love another and myself I hate. Weeping, I laugh, I feed on misery. By death and life so equally dismayed. For you, my lady, I am in this state. She doesn't even show up until the last line. These are not about Laura. They're about Francesco. They're about him, right? This one I picked because it's so wonderfully accessible. Of course, all of this antithesis here, the freezing and the burning and the locks and the loose and I mean, it's a wonderful, very immediate, right, sort of look at some of Petrarch's work. Lisa Cavariccia, our wonderful friend here at the British, in one of her texts, I don't remember which one, she compares this song to Elvis. Because of course, Petrarch, who is this modern man, who's our first tourist, who's the one who is, all about me, who is fashioning himself, Petrarch wrote love songs, right? Because love songs, most of them aren't about the actual beloved, right? They're not about the person. They're about the unrequited love, or the one who's been broken up with, or something. And so I love to include this because the more you think you don't know Petrarch, where would we be? But this idea, right, of love being so all-consuming that you feel, like you can't sort of get straight in your head. And so the Canzoniere is the thing, and as I said, it's the thing that will propel Petrarch into the person that we speak about today. We love an unrequited love story, right? Who wants to see happily ever after? I mean, that's why all the movies end at that point, right? It's like, give me the strife, get them together, and then let's go. But this, this notion of unrequited love, we love this. His relationship with Boccaccio later in his life was incredibly fascinating. We have several letters between the two of them. There's even some evidence that Boccaccio, thankfully, at a certain point he was on the precipice of throwing his manuscript of the Decameron onto the fire, and that Petrarch saved it from the flames. So thank you, Petrarch, for that. But they, as a sort of team and as friends, have a lot to say about certainly about humanism and civic humanism. They had lots of disagreements, the two of them. They were not similar in a lot of ways. At the very last minute, I took the title off of this slide because I put Petrarch's minor works, and it made me feel really bad because, bless, I want to kind of never put minor work as Africa. Anyway, I've just listed a few of them. The Trionfi, the Africa, the Secretum, Senides, again, these letters back and forth. The Secretum is a series of conversations between Petrarch and a kind of fictional Augustine. It is truly so. Anyone who gets annoyed with Petrarch, it's sort of, you read and he's so self-promotional and all this, and then you read the Secretum and you go, oh, this man, he suffered. He was constantly in conflict. This is someone who just deeply felt all of these contradictions. And so, I like to cut him a little slack after reading, not that I've read it cover to cover. But Petrarch will spend the last several years of his life in Artois, near Padua, so in the kind of Venetian sphere of influence. He dies there in 1374. And as I said, working on his editing and collection of the Canzoniere right up until the very end. Now, So Gail mentioned at the beginning, she said humanism when we asked, what about Petrarch? Certainly, right? And of course, I started out bring us into the Renaissance through Petrarch. And Leonardo Bruni wrote a really beautiful biography, very a positive look at Petrarch, better than Dante. So he didn't treat Dante very well, but Petrarch he did. But he did criticize his Latin. He said Petrarch thought his Latin was really good. It's actually not. We're going to sort of leave that to the side. But they recognize, right, these 15th century humanists, especially here in Florence. Number one, they recognized him as Florentine. Okay, so they're always bringing in as many people as they possibly can to be in this pantheon here of Florentine greats. And so Leonardo Bruni, sort of squarely does that. And he does, right, give him credit for being someone who ignited that passion for the study of antiquity. And that is exactly what he will take into, right, that kind of spirit of love and that passion for antiquity that will come into and be such a hallmark of the Renaissance. Laura, of course, as she was, alabaster skin, blonde hair, high forehead, dark eyes, red lips, red cheeks, there she is. In case you thought she existed, didn't exist, it does not matter, because Petrarch wrote, over 300 poems about someone who looked exactly like these women that we see in every museum, every church, every Madonna, every Venus, every patrician woman looks like a Laura. So, this continues to this day. The triumphs, his triumphi, had a huge impact on the visual arts as well, especially in the 15th century. But it will be, and I'll wind up here, it will be the 16th century. So why is it? Was it just because his Latin wasn't that great that we don't, look and read the Africa, for example? No, it's because in the 16th century, this new kind of spotlight that was being put on the Italian language, what kind of form should it take, right? Pietro Bembo, who was the number one influencer cultural man in the 16th century, he writes a book, Prose della Volgar Lingua, where he essentially sets out what form the Italian language should take. As you all know, the Italian language does not exist at this point, and it will not exist until unification in the 19th century. But there was, we're coming off of the period of the Italian wars. Things are, how can we come together? And language is the number one. And what does Bembo say? For poetry, we look at Petrarch. Dante, he's a wild card. You never know if he's going to go too low. Right? He can go high, but he goes too low. He's a wild card. We're going to put Dante over here. We're going to take Petrarch. His poetry is to be his style is to be the one that's emulated. Boccaccio for prose, and there you have it, right? Once that proclamation is made, that emphasis goes on to Petrarch in terms of language, and that is going to be the reason that we go into the 16th century and beyond. Oh, by the way, that circle is the three crowns, but in the foreground. But Dante is pointing to the Canzoniere in that painting. And so, I'm just wrapping up on the 16th century. Petrarch becomes so rooted and becomes so defined, right, connected, I guess I should say, to the illustrious vernacular, that the very first books that start to get printed in small format, we call them tascabili, right, pocket books, okay? And they're printed, the classics in particular, but also vernacular works of vernacular in Venice, by a publisher called Aldo Manuzio. He's absolutely incredible. He is thought of as the inventor of the tascabile, but many of these were actually called, whether or not they were Petrarch poetry or not, they were called Petrarchini. So women oftentimes were depicted in their portraits holding a Petrarchino, it would be called. So this is how, right, and why Petrarch's vernacular starts to become so much more familiar to us. So I'm going to end there. I'm very happy to answer questions, comments, anything. I see there's some chat stuff going on, but I don't know how to access that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Super. So we've got some light on. Oh yeah, I can see.
Oh, there's Jane.
And Jane, Jane. That's Jane.
Thank you, Jane.
Are you, show us your face, Jane.
She's,
Put the video on. Got to see her. There she is at the top.
yeah.
Thanks so much, Jane, for sponsoring this most entertaining and informative lecture. I now know lots more about Petrarch than I did at the beginning, which is great. I imagine a few other people in the room have the same feeling. So, as always, the format for the Q&A, if you're in the room and want to ask a question, make a comment, put your hand up, and I'll bring you the microphone. If you're on the Zoom, you can unmute yourself and talk to us, or else you can put something in the chat. Yeah, there's already quite a few things in the chat, I think. Open up the chat. Oh, yeah. Okay, but we'll start in the room as always, with one at the back first, then we'll come to you.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say I wish all my professors in university were you.
Oh,
I would have learned a lot more. Can you tell me
I'll tell
why Petrarch is Petrarch, not his Italian name, and why that's
absolutely. Yeah, great question. So I don't know if people on Zoom heard, but it was a wonderful question, which is why do we call him Petrarch and not his Italian name, which is Petrarca? And that is quite simply because we chose the Latinized version of his name. So much like we go with Florence in English, that's closer to the Latin Florentia rather than Fiorenza, Firenze, which comes out of the vernacular tradition. So it's just a way of us Anglos going back to the Latin. But yeah, very good question. Yeah.
We'll just take one of the comments from Kim Gottlieb Walker. Do you think Petrarch's unrequited love for Lyra influenced the popularity of courtly love? Writing the vernacular certainly made his work more accessible.
Yeah. Yes. Hi, Kim. No, so courtly love is a tradition that comes quite well. No, before it comes 12th, 13th century. Right. So I'm sort of looking at Ken and looking at everyone else as well. And so it's actually quite different. And in fact, courtly love was very much a sublimated sort of communication, let's say, of love, whereas something that is so innovative about Petrarch and which really sets him apart also from Dante and from other Dolcezza Nuovo poets in particular is that in the poetry about Laura, that he is very much using Laura, even though she is an ideal, she's flesh and blood. He tells us about her skin and her hair and her fingers, and at one point he sees her bathing. Okay, it's one of the most famous poems, where he comes on her bathing, and she is a woman. I mean, this is someone who is there. She's flesh and blood. Which is, of course, completely the antithesis of what Dante was doing with Beatrice, for example, in creating that kind of angel woman situation. Courtly love, again, sort of using the woman as an ideal to be able to communicate certain things. So it's very different in that sense, where she's much more of flesh and blood sort of thing. Yeah.
No, we have one here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you. This was absolutely fascinating to me. I knew very little about Petrarch, and now I know a lot more. And you made him feel like a human person, and not just some scholarly icon.
Yeah,
he seemed like a guy.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That was my goal. Because I didn't want to talk about his poetry for an hour. So yeah, perfect. Just kidding.
Yeah, the only thing I knew about Petrarch before this was his house and the rest of it. So it's really great to get to the bottom of something. But is there some kind of classical statement that he made, sort of like Descartes, I think, therefore I am? Is there anything like that?
Oh, good question. Oh, I love that, Mac. I think therefore I am, no, but he is credited, and I saw that it's in, it was one of the questions on the Zoom as well, in the chat. He is credited with the term Dark Ages. you can, I know most of us are kind of like, we don't use that anymore. And they weren't the Dark Ages, but his conception of the dark, which I think is really important, and it maybe not at the level of the Descartes, but certainly something that that stuck, and that certainly goes into this sort of idea of Renaissance humanism. What he was talking about was Petrarch was really one of the first to talk about a delineation. So making something, the light of antiquity had gone out, is what the claim that he was making in the kind of first, second century, that the light of antiquity had gone out, and that it was up to, again, maybe not his people, because he didn't have a whole lot of faith in them, but again, having this kind of hope for the future that it would come back to life. And so there are certain scholars and philosophers who see that light being riaccesa, right, being rekindled and relit during the Renaissance period. But what happened, unfortunately, with the term Dark Ages is that they became a derogatory term. And in fact, there's nothing more frustrating, and I'm sure many of you Gothic art that we love so much, and medieval works, and people say, oh yeah, the Dark Ages and nothing was happening. No, right? This is not the case. But this, for a long time, even when we were in school, it was kind of like there was the Dark Ages and then the Renaissance, as though, right? And so unfortunately the term got corrupted in that sense, but that's not really what Petrarch was saying. He was using it really to talk about the light of antiquity, and how that had been sort of snuffed out. He felt like but that it could come back. So let's say, yeah, he is correct. He is not the first one to use the term Middle Ages, although he does understand that there is a distinction between his time and antiquity. And that's really important, because most, especially Christian scholars, saw everything as a continuum, and that there was no separation. He saw a separation, which of course is going to be this tripartite view of history that's going to come.
There's a bunch of stuff in the chat. Sarah's usually put up
a link
Julia, for the upcoming course on mystic magicians and madmen of the Renaissance. So
Thank you.
It's easy to find information about that. She's also usually put up a weekly little reminder to the Zoomers to make their contributions. Thank you for that. And Julian Goschuk has said, I'd like to recommend Christopher Celenza's book, Everywhere a Wanderer, as a very readable supplement to your excellent presentation. So if you want more on Petrarch, Christopher Celenza.
I'll do, because it's Petrarch and I'm feeling myself here in self-promotion, I have a Substack. It's brand new. It's free. Anyone can read it. And I posted about this book this week because it is an excellent resource. It's Christopher Celenza. He's a professor. I can't remember his university at home. It's called Everywhere a Wanderer. He did not publish it with the university press, and so he did that on purpose because he wanted Petrarch to be a human and someone that anyone could access. He did an extraordinary job. It's a beautiful book. I might have brought it, actually. I think I did. Everywhere a Wanderer. So thank you, Julianne, for saying it. But it's a tiny little book. I don't know if the library has it, but if they don't, maybe someone will buy it for the library. But it's fabulous, and it's very accessible and wonderful. So hopefully you'll want to learn more about Petrarch. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julianne.
From sharing your quote in the beginning, he was a tourist at that point, and as the first tourist, he used the term Italy in that quote. I'm just curious, maybe to venture a guess of what Italy figuratively and literally meant to him at that point, or his contemporaries, if that was ever documented, because I haven't seen or heard Italy in a term that early.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a great point. And in fact, one of the kind of tough things about talking about or teaching the early modern period, or really any time before 1861, there is no Italy, right? But there is absolutely a concept of Italy. And for Petrarch, it meant something different than it meant in the 19th century. But he himself wrote a number of letters, but also a number of poems about Italy, and about not using the word unification, but certainly the idea, again, going back to antiquity, that this peninsula existed, right? And it's a Roman idea that he thought, right, would be a way, again, if they know about it, they'll do it. if they know about it, then we can sort of spur them on to that type of unity and that type of unification. And really, very interestingly, they do use this word. Dante as well uses Italy. But what is so interesting is that Machiavelli closes The Prince with Italia Mia by Petrarch. And so Machiavelli, 200 years after Petrarch, is going back to Petrarch's poetry to be able to make that claim and make that again sort of push. He's another one for unification in 1513 when he writes The Prince. So using it, but it's a great question, and it's one that means a whole lot of different things. But for Petrarch, it absolutely meant going back to that Roman idea of Italy and that geographical but also cultural expression. Yeah, thank you.
Lovely fan mail from Nancy Shearer that you should read.
Nancy, I will.
Stephen Leprouse says rather cryptically, Petrarch on Mount Ventoux. Yeah, he was that.
Yeah, he was. That's where we started. Yeah.
Anyone with more in the room? Zoom, is anyone feeling bold and wants to unmute and talk to us? We love hearing voices from across the world in the room. No, everyone's
shy. They're being shy. Very non-Petrarchan.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Did Petrarch write anything about Dante's comedy?
Oh, did he write? Well, I mean, the Trionfi for sure are a sort of, how should I say, kind of inspired by Dante. Listen, Boccaccio was obsessed with Dante. You know, he went on a kind of wild goose chase trying to find everything that he could about Dante and wrote a very shining biography of him. And we know that Boccaccio worked, huge super fan, and he worked to convince Petrarch to read Dante because he very famously said, I never read the comedy. But he says the reason why I don't, and whether or not he's being self-deprecating, but he says, I don't like to read things that are going to influence me and that I'm going to want to copy. And so whether or not he meant that, who knows, but that's what he told Boccaccio at a certain point. But the Triumphs by Petrarch, which of course were in Latin and were all about the unrequited love of Laura. You know, Dante, of course, has a triumph in the last canti of Purgatory, and so which has a completely religious connotation. Dante, Petrarch does not, and so it's a real break from that. But you know, they're very different. They're two crowns, but very different writers and very different philosophies. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Alex, thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned his low-level religious beliefs, and you talked about the relationship with the Colonna family. Can you say a bit more about it? And just from your talk, it didn't sound very good.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. He took low-level religious vows, which is different than low-level religious beliefs. He had pretty high-level religious beliefs. Meaning he took low level, meaning that he was receiving a stipend, but he wasn't, again, he wasn't a priest, a monsignor, a bishop, a cardinal, one of these things. But Petrarch was a devout Christian. And actually, thank you for bringing this up. It's a great observation because even here again, this is one of those points of contention within himself. Even in Rome, he talks very little about the Christian sites in Rome in that famous letter to Giovanni Colonna. He's much more interested in the antiquity, but then you see in his letters and in the Secretum and you know, his work with Augustine that he was constantly beating himself up about this because he says, I should be concentrating on that. And he is someone, actually, this is where Petrarch is a Christian humanist, because whereas someone like Leonardo Bruni, for example, in the next century, there's nothing Christian about Leonardo Bruni, but Petrarch actually saw that like a lot of Renaissance humanists, that antiquity and Christianity could be that antiquity could be a lens through which to view Christianity, and that they could be actually complementary and work together in that sense. And Petrarch felt that it was at the kind of nascent stages of that type of philosophy. It will come into its full flowering in the 15th century. But he was, I would say, very much a Christian. He was a believer, let's say that, and felt a great amount of, he felt a great amount of, I don't know what you would call that, contrast or shame sometimes at the fact that he didn't give enough of his time and brain space to Christian matters. Yeah.
I've actually got one which I'm desperate to ask.
Yeah.
He identified as a Florentine and was later claimed as a Florentine.
Mm-hmm.
Did he ever actually live in Florence?
No.
Never.
No.
He never lived in Florence.
He never lived in Florence. No, unlike Boccaccio. No, he never lived in Florence. But we don't let that get in the way of a good of citizenship. No.
The whole of the modern world was invented by Florentine.
Exactly. Yeah. No, he never did.
I was thinking of the parallel with Alessi, who was the next guy to go to Rome and have a good look and then make it concrete. Just literally.
Good one, Simon.
Florentine from Rome. It could go on forever. Alex,
I know.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
And before I let you go and sample the wine, just a reminder that the series of lectures starts in February.
Oh yeah, February 8th. Join us.
Commandment.
Yeah.
And if you can't get enough of our friend Alex, she's coming back to give another lecture in March 13th.
Mm-hmm.
Setting up the world of Dante, and that's a little prequel to something else that's going to be happening. So we're going to have a lot of Alex in the next few months. So we're certainly not going to go sick of the side of it. But just enjoy her special thing. So and now it's wine time. Before we drink the wine, I'm going to do another little commercial. The partnership is with, as I said, Basilica Caravaggio, and on the what's the date? On the 28th of March. 28th of March, just before Easter, we're taking a bus down to their winery in near Panzano, and we're going to have a wine tour and tastings, and we're going on to the fabulous restaurant at the Cantonetta di Vignano, which some of you may know, but it's a beautiful terrace with a view and good food. And we've got a limited number of places. We've only got one bus, and there's an early bird discount valid until the end of January. So all that is yours for just 110 euros. After that, the price goes up a bit. There are a few places left on the bus, so send us an email, talk to Sarah, whatever, to book your place on the bus. And now we can enjoy the wines from Basilica Caravaggio. Tonight we're drinking the really rather good Chianti Classico. And tomorrow night, if you come back to the lecture, we're switching up to the Reserva. Enjoy.
Wait a second. Tomorrow. Wait a second.